This will be the last Master Modes video I create until we have another iteration of the system to test. After taking the advice of ace pilots like Virgil, I've decided to spend a significant amount of time in Arena Commander testing it out, well over 100 hours to be exact. I believe I now have a firm enough grasp to provide you with a review of how it is currently playing, along with my thoughts on specific aspects of Master Modes, the challenges it faces, and the types of ships and archetypes we currently have in this version of the system. I've managed to become somewhat capable of holding my own in anything other than a light fighter. I perform exceptionally well in a Constellation, and started to do pretty well in a Vanguard towards the end, even managing to win a few 1v1s against opponents I know are better than me. I've learned a lot, observed a lot, and here are my takes. The short answer is yes. So far it is. The long answer is a bit more complicated. As groundwork for things to come, Master Modes is excellent. It has set a foundation to build upon and expand further into other mechanics that will add more depth to the system. It is certainly easier than a legacy flight model, and I do not think that is bad at all. However, it does maintain some strange nuances that even I don't fully understand yet, such as limiters, circular flight models, strawberry diagrams, eggshell accelerations, and dumpling diameters. None of that makes any sense to me and is a constant point of discussion in Discord servers and Spectrum. But what I do know is that I am having far more fun in Master Modes than I ever had in Legacy. There is no doubt room to improve, but there is also room to replicate the same bad results of the Legacy flight model by making too many concessions or changes to Master Modes. Some players are understandably unhappy with 1v1 duels, others are unhappy with the limitations placed upon the ship performances. I can understand all of that, but at the risk of upsetting what I now consider friends, I want to give the following opinion. In the grand scheme of things, 1v1 fights do not matter. Duels do not matter. I am a firm believer in designing around group play, and scaling that design up is a winner for MMO games. Getting as many players into those team battles, regardless of skill level, is the most important part of making an MMO game work for the long term. In my experience, games that feature large-scale combat but eventually start to focus on and cater to 1v1 duels, extreme small-scale skirmishes, or anything outside the scope of large battles are a sign of the game being in decline and a harbinger of its end. Perhaps not to the point where servers shut down, but the end of its popularity and what most normal players consider the game's life. This is not something new. You saw this as far back as DAOC. Bear with me here as I take you down memory lane and share with you my experiences before I become too senile to remember. In Dark Age of Camelot, you had two types of PvP players: the elite 8-man roamers and the large battle groups. Battle groups would be anywhere between 40 and 80 players and would focus entirely on keep sieges, relic raids, logistics, and everything else that made the game amazing. 8-man roamer groups usually just ran around E-main Maka and would duel other 8-mans, but then get angry when another 8-man or larger battle group came in and third-partied them. When this happened, those players would usually cry to Mythic about large groups, demand concessions to be made to encourage more 8-man activity, and keep them away from the battle groups in big battles. The big battles were, by the way, the major selling point of the product. As time went on, concessions were made, map changes were made, frontiers were changed, abilities were added, and in general, things were changed to put more emphasis on the smaller groups and duelers over the larger battle groups. Keep in mind, the battle groups comprised the majority of the player base. As these changes came, more and more of the battle group-centric players quit and went on to other games, leaving only the 8-man roamers to play in the empty frontiers. The game was essentially dead. Planetside 1 suffered a similar fate. In that game, you had Elite Fits, which were basically comprised of small, elite players who preferred to fly light aircraft such as the Mosquito, which was basically a Gladius, and partake in small-scale battles or duels in towers, or out in the middle of nowhere fighting in the sky. These players absolutely hated the larger outfits who were playing the game in a way it was meant to be played. Larger outfits, and players who followed those outfits, were playing for the big battles, the map control, and the bigger picture. As time went on, concessions were made and the game began to focus on smaller outfit play. They did this by changing the certification system to be more open to smaller groups, adding battle islands, which gave immense power to smaller outfits fighting for them, and introducing very powerful vehicles known as BFRs that small, elite players could use to fight off larger groups of players. The big outfits got fed up, left, and all that remained were the elite players dueling in towers, farming interlink facilities with overpowered weapons that only elite fits could spend the time getting, and flying around in mosquitoes farming smaller groups of players who didn't know that the game was no longer made for them. Guild Wars 2 is another prime example of what happens when an MMO game, which markets large-scale combat, which appeals to the masses, decides to pull a bait and switch and start shifting design to the small and elite. Guild Wars 2 launched with a 3-faction world versus world PvP mode that was massively popular. Big battles raging across multiple battlefields for control of what were essentially Daok relics that granted power to the servers who held them. ArenaNet abandoned all of this in favor of putting time, effort, and development into smaller scale esports and arenas, focusing on that portion of the player base over the significantly larger and more popular world vs. world community. As time went on, the larger scale community began to dwindle due to neglect and the negative impact balance and design decisions made to improve duels or small scale instanced esports combat started to harm the majority of players who enjoyed the larger, more accessible combat. As time went on, the population continued to drop until only a small elite few remained. They now comprise of worthless roamers ganking individual players who are on their way to the bigger fight. Once again, design around the few has negatively impacted the many, and the many have left. Planetside 2, often regarded as a subpar game by many, serves as a prime example of design incompetence. It encountered a fate similar to that of its predecessor, Planetside 1. The game heavily emphasized esports and outfit wars at the expense of larger outfits focused on territory control and grand objectives. Additionally, it diminished the importance of logistics and spawn control by introducing a redeploy mechanic, enabling smaller groups to instantly respawn at any desired fight. This dealt a significant blow to larger and more organized outfits, leading them to depart as they recognized that the game was no longer tailored to their needs. What remained were elite players farming inexperienced ones. As someone who held the undisputed #1 ranking in the world for Planetside 2, I witnessed the game finally shifting its focus towards an esports mode with numerous resources and patches aimed at fleshing out the competitive aspect of the sandbox game. However, the results were disappointing, with low participation, significant outfit burnout driving more players away, and the game now sitting at its lowest population ever. I can assert that catering excessively to the best, centering design around them, and disproportionately prioritizing the elite is detrimental to MMO game development. This serves as a crucial lesson for all involved in MMO game development. Star Citizen right now has some shocking parallels with these games. Arena Commander is essentially the E-main Maka of Star Citizen, and the players who are in it are the elite 8-man roamers. Should these players be listened to and their feedback appreciated? Absolutely. They know the game in and out better than almost everyone else in the PU. Should they be the driving force behind balanced decisions and designs? Absolutely not. What works best for the top 1% will not necessarily work for the remaining 99%. It is my concern that an excessive focus on 1v1 duels, esports, and inorganic competitive gameplay will influence design in a manner detrimental to the overall product. While these concepts may hold appeal for developers, are they truly beneficial for the broader player base? No, not by any means. Are those who prioritize duels, organized esport battles, and excessively high skill cap gameplay considering the context of this as an MMO game or a session-based competitive game? I've even heard some players reference Star Wars Squadron Battles, a game which is now defunct, as a benchmark for balance and design. Do I truly need to explain why drawing inspiration from such a title is ill-advised if aiming for success, particularly in an MMO setting? I believe not. How about those who mention Tarkov, Rust, or CSGO? None of these share significant similarities with Star Citizen in terms of MMO design and long-term success. CIG must draw a line in the sand and understand that satisfying both player groups entirely is untenable. A choice must be made, and the game should be tailored around the larger, average audience rather than the smaller, elite subset. And I am firmly on the side of designing the game around the larger, average audience, and not the small and elite. Now that I have finished that, I want to be very clear. I have an immense amount of respect for the mechanical skill players such as Virgil and organizations like his have as a whole. They fulfill a very important role within the SC community and provide a service and experience to players that no other group can for players seeking that style of play. Similarly, I believe that myself and organizations like mine are on the opposite end of the pendulum and represent a larger, bigger picture focused group that isn't getting as much of a voice as it deserves. The game just doesn't seem to be made for us yet. But this isn't about our organizations, or any organization for that matter. Master Modes is an important concept of development, and they must decide what their goals are and what type of game they want to make, the core audience they want to appeal to and ultimately retain. So, let's move on with the review and my opinions as of 3.22.x. SCM speeds for Master Modes, in general, feel quite satisfying. I find the fights much more manageable, merges are smoother, and team battles are far more engaging and dynamic. These positive changes are all attributable to the SCM speed enforcement, and the game is better off for it. However, accelerations seem a bit excessive. The transition from 0 to 100 occurs too rapidly, which I believe contributes to some of the negative experiences in Master Mode's combat. With the current acceleration values, I can change directions, manipulate my pip, and execute various maneuvers quite easily. Moreover, since I reach maximum speed so swiftly, I lack a true sense of ramp up or momentum, making the game feel slower than it actually is in that regard. I suggest that slightly reducing accelerations could enhance players' perception of Master Modes and its overall feel. One thing worth mentioning before I forget is how much I rely on backward strafing and its effectiveness. This might be attributed to the emphasis on forward-facing guns in the ships I prefer, leading me to aim to keep enemies in front of me as much as possible. However, at times, it feels like the main engines lack sufficient power. This is purely a perception issue. I lack evidence or numbers to support this feeling. Consider the Vanguard, for example. It boasts large engines, but they don't seem to provide significantly more forward thrust compared to the smaller thrusters pushing me backward. It's merely a perception issue, and I could be mistaken in this assessment. However, the more I contemplate it and consider buffing forward acceleration while nerfing reverse, it may just encourage jousting more than we currently have. I encourage you all to ponder this topic. It's quite significant, and my opinion isn't fully formed on it yet. I do hold the controversial opinion that I don't mind the effectiveness of backstrafing. This is almost certainly a bias of mine. I greatly prefer aiming gameplay over maneuverability, but that's just my preference. I understand some of you may disagree with that, and I respect that. I am a simple man. I aim at and destroy my target, and any movement I make is to aid in that aim. However, this is a good segue into the reoccurring topic of nose-to-nose encounters that keeps arising. When people mention nose-to-nose, I believe they're referring to two ships being unable to maneuver around each other, resulting in a standoff where the fight becomes a DPS race. Personally, I don't mind this aspect. As I mentioned earlier, I favor aiming gameplay over maneuverability, which stems from my background as an FPS player. Additionally, considering the nature of space combat and the freedom of movement in 6 degrees, encountering nose-to-nose situations seems inevitable. It would likely require something drastic, like entirely removing strafing and compelling ships to emulate jet fighters in space, with minimal or no strafing capabilities, to avoid such encounters. However, I doubt such a change would occur, and even if it did, I'm unsure if it would be enjoyable. Personally, I don't dislike or care enough about nose-to-nose encounters to desire a change. I acknowledge my bias. I simply enjoy the aim-focused gameplay. I understand this viewpoint may not resonate with everyone. I'm just a guy who relishes blowing up targets in front of my gun. What more can I say? If Master Modes wants to make Star Citizen flight more accessible, then they need to quickly address the biggest noob trap and hurdle of them all, which is the pip. How would you, as a regular player, ever understand that your pip is lying to you the vast majority of the time? You wouldn't. It turns green, and you shoot. Nothing hits. Nothing hits because unless you are 500 meters or closer, you are unable to actually land shots during space combat. The pip is a lie, and it has been lying to players for years now. Nobody is going to know unless told that if you shoot at anything beyond 500 meters, you are likely to miss. This has to be changed. The pip must be changed. Ideally, you would see the lead pip completely removed and replaced with a lag pip only. Where you aim is where it hits. That is what players are going to expect. Not this black magic nonsense where you have to whisper incantations just to get your shots to land on target. Ideally, and I know this will never happen, I'd like to see the pip completely removed and have weapon velocities increased massively to compensate. Also, have the ship set convergence automatically to whatever you're locked onto. If they want World War II in space, then let's remove the fancy pip nonsense, which doesn't work, in favor of some good old-fashioned traditional aiming. I bet the game would feel a lot better as a result too. Another thing I hate about the pip is that it feels like a good portion of the fights you get into, whether they are 1v1 or team fights, are all about manipulating the pip that your enemy sees when they have you targeted. I've seen that thing wiggle and move in all sorts of unnatural ways during fights when going up against somebody who isn't bad. It's frustrating, it isn't fun, and I hate it. My brain is telling me to aim at the pip because the pip is supposed to help me hit the target. But I know that the pip is lying, and my opponent knows how to make the pip lie to me even more than it usually would. It's not fun. It just isn't fun. I would rather just aim for the target on my own and let my gunnery skills decide whether I hit or not. You know, I want to go on a slight rant here, but has anyone ever played a game that is this far advanced in development and something as trivial as how you aim your weapons and hit your targets is still not functioning? I don't usually take shots at CIG, and I don't think this is one either, but this is such a perplexing issue that I cannot wrap my head around how it is even a thing. If you know the lead pip is a lie and is an issue, why did you remove or limit the lag pip and enforce a lead pip? Why not just remove the lead pip since it is causing all of the problems? The only thing it is good for is knowing where your enemy is going so you can adjust your strafes to merge into him or get away from him. The tool in which you're supposed to use to aim is actually terrible for aiming. Let me briefly explain what the power triangle currently does in this version of Master Modes. Allocating full power to weapons increases capacitor size and regeneration rate, while directing full power to shields reduces damage taken and enhances shield regeneration rate. On the other hand, Channeling full power to engines enhances maneuverability, including pitch and yaw, while also increasing the boost regeneration rate. Now that we all know what it does, let's talk about it. First and foremost, I find the power triangle minigame annoying and an unnecessary APM tax for players to use, assuming you're actively using it. Additionally, I find it less of a choice and more of a scripted decision you make once certain conditions are met. For example, you just fired all of your weapons. Time to max out weapons. Or you're in a duel. Max out shields until they fall. Then max something else out. Did you get jousted by an enemy? Max out engines and turn faster to get nose on. I understand people probably enjoy this. But after 100 hours of this, it just feels like Simon Says, and isn't really making me feel like I am actually making decisions. If it were up to me, the power triangle would be something that is only used by ships Constellation size and larger, and handled almost exclusively by a co-pilot or engineer, with more depth of course. And with the depth would come enhanced power and buffs. I don't hate the power triangle. I just think it isn't a very fun mechanic to have to constantly utilize. It isn't fun because I view it as a conditional decision and not a dynamic one. I also find it boring to use because anything below 100% is pointless. The whole thing just feels somewhat poorly thought out. I ain't expecting it to be removed, or even really changed. This is just my opinion. I still use it, and I use it well. I just don't feel like a lot of thought goes into how I use it, and that makes it somewhat boring. I do, however, like how they are trying to make it more interesting. But in an ironic twist, by trying to make it more interesting, it has become more static and scripted. Perhaps there is no way to get the impactful choice or decision making I seek from the power triangle. There might not be, and that is okay. It just means I'm complaining about something that isn't an issue. But again, after about 100 hours, I did feel like I was following a script with the thing, and it just didn't strike me as something I would miss if it were to be gone. I appreciate Nav Mode. It's not some get-out-of-jail-free card, as some people portray it. It's a decision with consequences. You need to initiate evasion, gain some distance, perhaps even momentum, before utilizing it. And you must accept that you will likely sustain damage or even get destroyed while attempting to escape. In a strange way, they're adding a level of skill to fleeing, and that's commendable. I've always seen evasive maneuvers as a legitimate tactic in the game, and now, with skill involved, it becomes something players can practice and improve upon. However, I better not hear any complaints when a QED ship prevents your escape. If people bring ships specifically designed to hinder your retreat, you'll have to accept it as part of the game sometimes. That being said, I haven't personally used Nav Mode extensively. Since death isn't as impactful in Arena Commander as it is in the Persistent universe, I usually fight to the end and respawn. Therefore, I can't provide detailed insights into its specific usage. As for those who used it to evade me, I simply ignored them and shifted focus to other targets instead. One issue that has been bothering me for some time is how CAG is handling ballistic weapons. I'm not a fan of how they simply bypass shields. This creates scenarios of inconsistent damage on targets, damage to minor components that otherwise shouldn't be affected due to shielding, and overall is just an annoyance I cannot support. I would much rather see ballistics follow the same rules as energy weapons, but be highly damaging with finite resource. Not too finite though. I'd actually give them a bit more ammo than they have now. However, this whole concept of ignoring shields is rather impractical and will likely lead to behavior similar to what we see in a Persistent universe under the Legacy system, where people use full ballistic Corsairs or Infernos and can melt ships in seconds. Even ships with hundreds of thousands worth of hull HP. The ships end up being destroyed before their shields even deplete. If ballistics were to remain as they are, I predict that when stakes are high, people will tend to gang up and use full ballistics to inflict permanent hull damage upon their enemies. Or perhaps, Is this another one of those wait for armor situations? Either way, I'd like to see ballistics not bypass shields, have more ammo, and even more damage. I'd trade sustainability for alpha damage. Missiles are not only frustrating to be hit by, but also prove to be equally vexing to utilize due to their unreliable performance. While acknowledging their presence for the sake of completeness in this review, it's clear that missiles lack the depth necessary to make them truly engaging. If the system remains as straightforward as fire and forget without further complexity, missiles will inevitably fluctuate between overperforming and underperforming. Perhaps in the future, I'll delve deeper into the intricacies of missiles in a video.
My name is Travis. I am the Moon Star.
This one is a major point of contention. I want to start with the Interceptor archetype first, though, before jumping into the Buccaneer. The idea they have set out for an Interceptor confuses me. Currently, it seems defined by a ship that is very fast in a straight line, cannot be outrun, and seemingly cannot be caught. If that is your design goal, once you leave the fishbowl that is AC, you are now left with an archetype that encompasses everything wrong with the legacy flight model and why we left it in the first place. Don't want to die? Fly an Interceptor. Don't want people to be able to run away from you? Fly an Interceptor. Death has once again become a choice, and none of your fights require commitment. I think this is a poorly thought out archetype that doesn't need to exist. It's basically legacy flight model, the archetype, and I foresee nothing but problems with it. This all may change, of course, and likely will, but this one has been really rubbing me the wrong way. Unfortunately for me, the biggest problem I have observed from this is the poor Buccaneer is caught up in the mess. What was once defined as a light fighter has been pushed into this new role. For the first time in its history, the Buccaneer was finally useful. Sadly, it appears it has flown too close to the sun and is now scheduled for a nerf. I cannot say I disagree with it, but I am pretty confident it'll once again be cast aside and thrown into the dumpster where it has been since its creation. I'd much rather it be reclassified as a light fighter or even medium, something more durable than most other ships in its class, but with tremendous firepower for its size, but poor maneuvering. The issue with nerfing its HP is the ship is mostly engine, and losing just one usually sends it off into a spin. With all that said, I hardly see these things in squadron battles. You'd think for something as OP as everything claims it is, you would see it non-stop. I still mostly see everything but this ship. Sometimes I see a loser in it doing hit and runs, which I suppose it was meant to do, but since I am usually in a Constellation or Vanguard, that thing has little impact on me, and it usually ends up being an easy kill. I would, however, like to add that I think the Interceptor role, and to an extent the Buccaneer, are victims of a game with no true purpose or objective. If the only thing to do in the game that matters is to kill and not be killed, the ship and ship class that caters to those two things becomes the most powerful and used. If you had objectives, space to control, or anything to fight over, I do not think you would see these ships being perceived as OP since they would have no staying power. Just some food for thought. I am under no illusions that the Interceptor role is going to be scrapped, nor do I think the Buccaneer is going to be changed in a way that makes it anything other than useless. I've never played a game where the medium anything is good. By design, it is an in-between of two extremes. In this case, it is in between the maneuverability and evasiveness of the light fighter and the durability and firepower of the heavy fighter. It simply isn't good at either one, and perhaps that is the design. So design is for it to be confused and bad, a halfway point with no true definition. Once again, much like I mentioned when talking about the Interceptor, Without an objective, goal, or purpose, it is very hard for me to provide realistic feedback on how things could, should, or do work outside of the AC encounters. Using the knowledge I have now, if I were to say, want to fight for control of an objective where staying power would be important, I would never opt to bring in a medium and would instead go heavy. If I wanted to get into small skirmishes or duels, I would most likely go with something that is lighter. If requiring an insane amount of personal skill to make a medium work is mandatory, that doesn't mean it is good. It just means you're good enough to make something bad good. But it is still bad. On the flip side, if the medium fighter becomes a soft counter and was good at everything but excellent at nothing, I would simply spam these in the highest quantity possible. If they can counter everything a little bit, when used in mass, they scale exponentially and become overpowered. Stuff to consider when designing a jack-of-all-trades anything in games. What happens when you bring a lot of those jacks? Devs never seem to consider that. Don't know if CAG has. So how is the F7C Hornet? It's simply okay. Not spectacular, not amazing, and not something that I really view as a threat in a Vanguard or a Constellation. I don't fly it much, if at all. I think it's a cool ship, very iconic. But to me, it just doesn't do anything that a Vanguard or Gladius doesn't do better. For some reason, they're using the Super Hornet variant too, which is strange. I don't think I would ever want a gunner in that thing. But yeah, it's just okay. Nothing about it screams out to me. It really is just a medium fighter that doesn't do anything particularly well. Perhaps if used in mass it could own? We may not know the answer to that for quite some time. I have yet to see one flown by any pilot that makes me think it is excellent. I want to be clear, it isn't bad. Oh no, not at all. It just isn't great. But I guess that is the point. This is about as light as I will go on the fighter weight classes. And it is my prediction that as more of these are added to master modes, they will, when crewed, make both light and medium fighters extinct. They seem to be designed to be the ultimate anti-light fighter class of ships provided they are fully set up with gunners. I can see the meta evolving around these things once more serious orgs and players start getting into the game. For every 2 light or medium fighters on the field, you'll have 1 crewed heavy. But if the Hurricane or Scorpius from Live are any indication of performance, these things will have no issue fighting even when outnumbered. I think the heavy fighters will be the go-to for serious business PvP in the future. I could be wrong, but I am probably not. But we don't have access to real heavy fighters like the Hurricane and Scorpius yet, so instead we have the Vanguard. It's not bad, it's not great. I find it odd that its laser repeaters are lower velocity than the other laser repeaters currently in the game. Is that an oversight? It must be, because the Deadbolt ballistic cannon on it has higher velocity than those things. I'd like to see those little laser repeaters have their speed brought up to match the Deadbolt. It would make the weapons on that ship a lot more fun to use. The ability to gimbal the Deadbolt is a bit worthless too, since you cannot manually control the guns built into the nose in the same way. So activating manual gimbal disables those. It just makes the ship a bit cumbersome to use. And that is how I would describe the Vanguard currently. Cumbersome. Between managing your ballistic overheat and low velocity repeaters, it just feels like a chore to fly sometimes. The turret is also completely worthless and doesn't hit anything. But that is pretty universal for all turrets now, and while it is tough, I find that the only way to get the most out of the size 2 shield generator it has is to run full power to shields almost all the time. I would have to wait and see how it performs once turrets are fixed to give it a proper review. But right now, I'd like to see those weapon velocities on the ship brought up. It suffers a lot from having low velocity weaponry considering the size of the ship, especially since it doesn't have the raw punch of the Constellation, which for the record has higher velocity weaponry. In the Vanguard's current state, I cannot see why I would ever use it over a Constellation. I have spent the vast majority of my time in the Connie, and I really have nothing bad to say about it in terms of performance. It is large, tough, has tremendous firepower, and can kill anything stupid enough to stay in front of it. But it dies to a single light fighter who can stay behind it. That's great. But I feel like the Constellation is a testament to how bad multi-crew gameplay is, how undefined, unfleshed out, and underdeveloped it is. I don't want to fly the Connie and succeed in it as a solo pilot. That is what a heavy fighter is for. I want to have a crew, turret gunners, a co-pilot, and a snub pilot. I want all of that. But in the game's current state, I would never use any of those. In theory, you can have a crew of 5 for this ship, the pilot, 2 gunners, co-pilot, and snub pilot. No group of players outside of LARPing morons would ever do that. Smart players will just bring 4 additional Connies to cover each other. Why does the pilot have so much power in this ship? Is it not intended to be an introduction to multi-crew gameplay? If so, as stated earlier, it is failing at that. This ship needs to be reined in, and the multi-crew component needs to be forced. And if it is forced, it can also be made to be more powerful to reflect that. I would compare the Connie in its current state to the poor design decisions made by games such as Battlefield 3 and its most popular mod, Planetside 2. In those games, powerful vehicles were piloted by individual players, and crew was optional. Star Citizen is currently going down this road with this ship, and if it isn't reined in early, you will have players getting comfortable with this style of play the same way people got comfortable with nonsense 45s, tricords, and general light fighter dominance. My suggestion would be to drastically buff the performance of the turrets, enhance the power triangle usage, and give control of that to the co-pilot, along with the missiles. And leave the snub as optional. This would ensure that a minimum of 4 players is required to make the Connie perform at full capacity. I'd argue it should get some buffs to reward and encourage that style of play too, because simply enforcing that now in its current state would leave it in a poor, underperforming state. A fully crewed vehicle should act as a force multiplier, able to handle more enemies with a crew than any group of solo piloted ships regardless of class. If you're good at game design, MMO game design in particular, you would understand that a vehicle's power and performance should be limited by the amount of individual brains working together. The more brains required, the more powerful the vehicle can be. This is the trade-off, the tax you pay. If you're willing to wrangle players together, lead them, and coordinate them, you should be rewarded with a significantly powerful vehicle that can mop the floor with numerous individual vehicles and pose a very real threat to poorly crewed vehicles of its class and higher. If CIG doesn't agree with this philosophy, I can tell you right now how I and the Enclave are going to break your game and abuse this. We're not going to crew ships like the Connie. We're going to bring as many big ships with individual pilot firepower as possible. So long as only one brain is required to make this ship perform at a realistic peak performance that the game acknowledges, we are going to spam those. CIG has to wake up and understand that players are not going to play the game the way they designed it to be played. They are going to play it the way which works the best. This isn't just a Connie issue. This is an issue that will scale up and only become worse. Let me give you some examples that will happen right now in the game's current state. So long as a pilot can control power, bombs, and countermeasures, players will use numerous A2s to carpet bomb an area with massive bombs. So long as the pilot can launch torpedoes from the Retaliator, players will ignore all other stations and spam as many of these size 9s as possible to overwhelm the larger ships. These same concepts apply to the Corsair or any other large ship currently in the game or scheduled to be in the game. Unless they force players to crew stations to get the absolute most out of these ships, along with giving them very powerful rewards for doing so, you will see these larger ships treated the same way as disposable light fighters. Get this under control now before it is too late. I am fine with either decision CIG makes. I and the Enclave will succeed regardless of what CIG does in this regard. I am just warning you right now of the detrimental impact to gameplay these ships will have unless they are reined in and multi-crew is made essential to performance. And again, performance is adjusted to reflect the work that goes into it. Because if they make it unrewarding, people will find other, smaller, more manageable options to spam. Another thing I would like to add before moving on is how their counters will be addressed. If one Ares can solo a fully crewed Connie, then the Connie should retain its individual pilot performance because now you're moving the pendulum too far in the direction of single-seaters again. And the Connie would have to match that design. Perhaps it would take 2 Ares to defeat a crewed Connie? I can see that. This is all speculation, but very good food for thought. I hope Seiji watches this video and listens to this part in particular because I'm telling you with 20 plus years of MMO experience, not just 20 years of being a bad, but 20 plus years of effectiveness and abuse of mechanics, I can see the writing on the wall, and I can see exactly what is going to happen unless a solid design goal is presented and strived for. This vehicle epitomizes inefficiency in its intended role and is primarily utilized as a joke, either for ramming antics in Arena Commander or to mock its inadequacies. It serves as a prime example of a ship crafted more for marketing than practical gameplay. Currently, it holds no functional significance or utility within the game's framework. Without substantial revisions, both in terms of game mechanics and the ship's design, it remains destined to be a perpetual punchline. I see no value in further discussing this turd. So, in conclusion with this one, this was a long video. You know I love Master Modes, you know I like it. And you probably think I hate light fighter guys and duelers and the elite. I totally don't. I understand that this game can be for everybody, and it should be for everybody. That's a very noble goal. But I do not believe that CIG, because in all the years I've played games, I've never played one that fully satisfies both camps. And CIG has not even managed to get a flight model working in 10 years that they're happy with. So why would I have any confidence they can actually be the first game to ever appeal to every single audience? They simply can't. It's an unreasonable expectation for me or anybody to have. But they could make a good game. And I think they're on the road to making a good game. I think Master Modes is a very important step onto that road. It's not going anywhere. I don't care if you can whine, complain, you can make as many posts as you want, you could talk about the skill ceiling, the skill floor, Newtonian physics, or any other bull. It's not going to matter. Get over it. No amount of your crying is going to change the Master Modes. Don't just look at it from a gameplay point of view. Look at it from a business point of view. Do you think that they've spent this much time paying the employees, doing this work, just to scrap it because you think it sucks? No, they're not going to do that. You're either going to accept it as it is right now, that this is what they're going to have in the game, or you're going to move on. If you don't like the way it plays, go play FurryNet, or HunterNet. FurryNet, HunterNet, whatever it is, right? Go play that game. Leave everybody else alone. But in terms of the archetypes and everything else I talked about here, they're good concepts. And I think they're needed concepts. They're basically classes, and players like that. They like classes and they like roles. That's probably my favorite takeaway from Master Modes in general. I'm just not fully sold on all the classes, so to speak. But this video is already long enough. I don't want to waste any more time for you guys. Hit me up in the comments. Leave me all that stuff that you love to do. Come fight with me. We'll duke it out. You'll call me names. I'll call you names and talk about your mom. It'll be fun like always. Look forward to it.